What if I told you that the Africa of our imagination isn't a real place? Hi, my name is Mumbi, and in this essay, I want to talk about the invention of Africa and the brilliant work of Congolese philosopher Mudimbe. So, the premise here is really simple. Africa is not just a geographic place. Okay, but what else could it be? Well, according to Mudimbe, Africa is also a colonial discursive invention. But in order to understand this, I think we need to have an idea of Africa pre-colonization. So here I read from a paper by Ipadiola where she writes that before the advent of colonialism, Africa was a vast continent of diverse peoples with multifarious cultures, worldviews, ideals, ideas, historical trajectories, and aspirations. So, what this tells us is that prior to colonization, people on the African continent identified and organized themselves as peoples. Um, Maybe the word you might be familiar with is tribes, but today we know the colonial history of the word. So instead, quoting Gituku, we can say autonomous indigenous political polities, or as Wangari Maathai called them, micronations. I remember in my literature class in high school, we read Chimamanda's Half of a Yellow Sun, and I'll never forget this line where she wrote something like, "My point is that the only authentic identity for the African is the tribe. I am Nigerian because the white man created Nigeria and gave me that identity. I am black because the white man created black to be as different as possible from his white, but I was Igbo before the white man came." And this is just to emphasize the importance of this way that African peoples identified and organized themselves as micronations. Just a note, however, that I do believe the invention of blackness does predate colonialism. But so back to the invention of Africa. So, when the colonizers arrived on the continent, one thing that they needed to do in order to justify colonization was that they needed to justify themselves as superior to the other. You can go read about otherism, capital O. But when they arrived on the continent, they didn't find an other, they found others. So, what they needed to do was to essentialize and to homogenize Africa into a single Africa, for the which could be measured against Europe in order to justify the colonial project and to make it more effective. Um, and so the result of this is that it invented a generic, essentialized identity of African, which still lives in our vocabularies today. So, a radical reading of Mudimbe, now that we know this, that Africa as an essentialized generic concept was a colonial invention, a radical reading of Mudimbe would tell you that, okay, then in order to reject the colonial legacy, then we must reject this colonial invention of Africa. However, I have a question here because as somebody who likes to think of myself as like a post-colonial Pan-Africanist, what does that mean for me? But I'll save this question to answer at the end of this video. Before we get there, um, I think Mudimbe's work tells us something really important, that the way African emerged isn't the same way that the West or Western emerged. And it explains to me how, for example, when you talk about the West or something being Western, nobody ever demands specificity from you because we understand that the West isn't a monolith. And I mean, Western in itself denotes diversity. But whenever you talk about something being African, then all of a sudden you're running the risk of essentializing and everybody wants you to be specific. But that in itself is the invention. And I think Mudimbe was so brilliant for pointing this out. Um, So yeah, so back to my question, that if a radical reading of Mudimbe would tell you that to reject the colonial legacy, we have to reject the colonially invented idea of Africa, then what happens to Pan-Africanism? But I think post-colonial scholarship would tell us that we still do need that African identity, or African as a concept. Of course, not the essentialized colonial one, but one of solidarity, of post colonial legacy. Of course, taking into account that the colonial experience was not uniform everywhere on the continent. Um, but I think it says something that we can learn a lot about ourselves. We can learn a lot about ourselves by learning about each other. And for me, I think that's one of the like pillars of Pan-Africanism. That also, I think the for me why this makes sense is that because one thing about African peoples, we are not passive at all. So we are actively engaged in the uninvention of Africa and the redefinition of what being African means for us today. And so, for that reason, the way that we talk about Africa today, it's not the generic essentialized one, but it's one of post colonial solidarity and post colonial scholarship. And I think just being always cognizant of that, that when we speak about Africa, we're not speaking about it in a homogenized, essentialized, generic way, but we're speaking of Africa in a plural sense. Um, yeah. And so for me, I think that's what Pan-Africanism for me means, and post-colonial scholarship. Yes, so I think that's all I wanted to say in this video on the invention of Africa and the work of Mudimbe. It's of course, I can't put it all into one video, but I thought it's just really important to talk about it now because um, in more essays, when I talk about African, I just think it's important to ground where that African is coming from, that I'm speaking of Africa from a post colonial Pan Africanist lens and not the essentialized generic colonial invention that it was. So yeah, asante kwa kutazama, and come back for the next essay, and I'm going to get into African philosophy. I'll start with the philosophy part and then I'll go back to the African part. So just remember this essay when we're talking about African philosophy and what does the African in African philosophy means. But yeah, thank you for listening to this essay. Tafakari hayo, and I'll see you in the next one, or you'll hear me in the next one. Bye.